November 8, 1975. The Gulf of Riga, Soviet Latvia. Under the cover of darkness, the Soviet frigate Storozhevoy, the Sentry, slips its moorings. It's a brand-new, technologically advanced warship, a jewel of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet. But it is not on a sanctioned patrol. It is committing an act of profound, unthinkable rebellion. At its helm is not the ship's captain, but its political officer, Captain Third Rank Valery Sablin. In the West, this incident would become the spark of inspiration for a legendary techno-thriller, The Hunt for Red October, a story of a disaffected captain defecting to the United States with a revolutionary submarine. The reality, buried by the Kremlin for decades, was infinitely more complex, more dangerous, and, in the eyes of the Soviet state, far more terrifying. This was not a defection. It was a pro-Leninist revolt. Sablin was not a capitalist sympathizer. He was a fervent, idealistic communist who believed the Brezhnev regime had betrayed the soul of the revolution. He was not sailing for America. He was sailing for Leningrad, to moor alongside the cruiser Aurora, the very symbol of the 1917 Bolshevik uprising, and broadcast a new revolution to the nation. The Kremlin's response was not a measured pursuit. It was a panicked, chaotic scramble involving 13 warships and over 60 aircraft, culminating in a desperate chase where commanders reportedly invoked launch procedures for missiles that were nuclear-capable, a step that brought the crisis perilously close to disaster. Their panic was not over the loss of one political officer. It was over the terrifying prospect of the Storozhevoy itself, a top-secret, apex engineering platform designed to hunt and kill American nuclear submarines, falling into the hands of NATO. This is the story of the real hunt for Red October, a story of a deep ideological mutiny, a chaotic, friendly fire-plagued battle at sea, and the revolutionary engineering from COGAG turbines to variable depth sonar that made a single frigate a strategic asset worth risking a nuclear incident to destroy. The 1984 Tom Clancy novel, The Hunt for Red October, and the subsequent blockbuster film depicted a brilliant Soviet submarine captain, Marko Ramius, defecting to the United States with a technologically advanced ballistic missile submarine. This narrative, a staple of Cold War fiction, is a complete and total inversion of the 1975 event that inspired it. To understand what truly happened in the Baltic Sea, we must first discard the fiction. The reality was not a betrayal of communism, but a betrayal in the name of it. The central figure was not a cynical defecting captain, but the ship's political officer, Captain Third Rank Valery Sablin. As the Zampolit, Sablin was the Communist Party's ideological enforcement officer, the immune system placed on board every vessel to ensure loyalty and prevent exactly the kind of counter-revolutionary thought he was about to unleash. Sablin was by every measure a model Soviet officer. He was a hereditary naval man, a graduate of the prestigious M.V. Frunze Higher Naval School in Leningrad, and a dedicated member of the Communist Party. His peers, noting his fervent belief in the system, called him the class conscience. But his dedication was not to the state, but to the ideal. Sablin was a pure, zealous Leninist. He looked at the Soviet Union under Leonid Brezhnev and saw not a worker's paradise, but a stagnant swamp of bureaucratic privilege, corruption, and profound hypocrisy. He believed the regime had betrayed the true Leninist principles of justice, equality, and transparency. In his writings, Sablin condemned the ruling elite as a privileged bureaucracy, a caste concerned only with their own power and wealth, not the welfare of the people they claimed to serve. The profound irony of the mutiny is that it was led by the Zampulet, the very ideological watchdog the system had created to enforce loyalty had turned against it, using the system's own dogma, pure Leninism, to condemn its corrupt practice. Sablin's goal was not America. His destination was Leningrad, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. The plan was steeped in potent historical symbolism. He intended to sail from Riga up the Gulf of Finland and navigate the Neva River. He would then moor the Storozhevoy, a symbol of modern Soviet power, directly alongside the museum ship Aurora. The Aurora was the cruiser whose cannon shot in 1917 had famously signaled the start of the Bolshevik Revolution. From this powerful platform, Sablin planned to broadcast a national radio and television address. He would publicly denounce the corrupt bureaucrats of the Brezhnev regime and call for a new, pure communist revolution, a return to the true Leninist ideals he believed had been abandoned. He was not defecting, he was attempting to reboot the entire Soviet experiment. On the night of November 8, 1975, while the Storozhevoy was moored in Riga, Latvia, Sablin initiated his plan. He used his authority as Zampolit to lure the ship's captain, Anatoly Putorny, to the forward sonar compartment, using a false report of officers being drunk on duty, a believable complaint in the Brezhnev-era Navy. Sablin then locked Putorny and other loyal officers inside the compartment. He then assembled the ship's 150-plus crewmen and delivered a powerful, charismatic speech outlining the regime's corruption and his plan to demand a return to Leninist justice. He then performed a critical, symbolic act. He held a vote. This was not a simple military coup. It was the first act of his new, pure Soviet, or council, power. By having the sailors, the proletariat, vote, he was symbolically restoring the council he believed the bureaucracy had destroyed. The officers were split. A vote using checker pieces reportedly resulted in a tie. The vast majority of the crew, however, composed largely of young 18- and 19-year-old conscripts, were swayed by their popular political officer and voted to support the mutiny. The dissenting officers were locked in their cabins. At approximately 0200 hours on November 9th, Valery Sablin ordered the lines cast off. The Storozhevoy slipped its moorings and, with its radar off to avoid detection, headed for the dark, open waters of the Gulf of Riga. When word of the mutiny finally reached the Kremlin, the reaction was not of political embarrassment, it was one of absolute, visceral panic. This was not because a political officer had snapped. It was because he had seized a vital asset, a technological marvel that represented one of the highest achievements of Soviet anti-submarine warfare, or ASW, engineering. The Storozhevoy was a state secret, a platform specifically designed with one purpose: to hunt and kill America's most important strategic weapon, the nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarine. The Storozhevoy, Russian for sentry or vigilant, was a brand-new frigate commissioned less than 2 years prior. It was a Project 1135 Burevestnik, or Petrol class, designated by the Soviets as a Bolshoi Protivolodachny Korabl, a large anti-submarine ship. NATO, recognizing its formidable capabilities, assigned it the reporting name Krivak-I. In 1975, it was the Soviet Navy's premier platform for strategic ASW, a 3,600-ton hunter built for the deep, cold waters of the North Atlantic. The Kremlin's fear was not about a single piece of technology,
but about losing an entire integrated ASW kill web. To understand their panic, we must deconstruct the revolutionary engineering that made the Storozhevoy a strategic prize. It begins with its legs, a propulsion system that gave it the speed of a hunter. The Krivak-I class was one of the first major Soviet warships to be powered exclusively by a COGAS, or combined gas and gas plant. This was a radical departure from older, slow-to-react steam turbine plants. Similar to a jet engine, a gas turbine can generate immense power almost instantly. The Krivak's COGAS system used two sets of powerful gas turbines per shaft, two smaller M62 turbines for efficient cruising, and two massive M8K boost turbines for high-speed interception. This engineering provided two distinct advantages. It allowed for high fuel efficiency and long range, nearly 5,000 nautical miles, by running only on the small cruise turbines. But when a target was detected, the crew could engage the boost turbines, unleashing over 50,000 horsepower and pushing the frigate to a blistering 32 knots. This sprint and drift capability was essential for chasing down a fast, quiet nuclear submarine attempting to escape. But speed is useless if you are blind. The ship's true secret lay in its ears. The Krivak-I sensor suite was engineered to defeat the single most effective tactic of American submarines: hiding in thermal layers, or thermoclines. These are horizontal layers in the ocean where the water temperature changes abruptly. These layers act like a mirror or a lens, bending and scattering sonar pings, effectively making a submarine hiding beneath them invisible to surface ships. The Storozhevoy had a two-part solution. First was the MG-332 Titan II, or bullnose, powerful medium-frequency sonar mounted in the ship's bow for active and passive listening. But the real secret weapon was the MG-325 Vega, known to NATO as Mairtail. This was a variable depth sonar, or VDS. It was a towed fish packed with hydrophones that could be lowered hundreds of feet into the ocean on a cable. The Mairtail could be dropped below the thermal layer, completely unmasking any American SSBN that believed it was hiding safely. This system gave the Storozhevoy the ability to see where many other surface ships were blind. With the Mairtail to find the target and the COGAS turbines to chase it, the Storozhevoy needed one final piece of engineering to complete its mission: a weapon that could strike its prey from a safe distance, far outside the range of an enemy's torpedoes. This was its sting. The Storozhevoy's main armament was the RPK-3 Metel missile system, known to a terrified NATO as the SSN-14 Silex. This was not a simple missile. It was a complex, integrated, rocket-propelled torpedo. Upon acquiring a sonar lock from the bullnose or Mairtail, the Storozhevoy would launch the SSN-14. The solid-fuel rocket would travel at high subsonic speed, approaching Mach 0.95, covering the distance to the target area, which could be roughly 90 to 100 kilometers away. Once over the submarine's predicted position, the rocket's payload would detach and deploy a homing torpedo that would search for the submarine, or, most chillingly, a nuclear depth charge. This standoff weapon system was the engineering marvel that terrified the Kremlin. It allowed the Storozhevoy to destroy an American nuclear-armed submarine from nearly 100 kilometers away, far beyond the 10 or 15-kilometer range of an enemy submarine's torpedoes. The U.S. Navy at the time had no direct equivalent in wide service. The Kremlin's panic was total. The U.S. nuclear strategy rested on the invulnerable bastion of its ballistic missile submarines, or boomers. The Soviet bastion doctrine was created to hunt these boomers, and the Krivak-I was its premier hunter-killer. The Kremlin's immediate, terrified assumption was that Sablin was defecting to Sweden, just 32 miles from where he would be stopped. If Sablin, whose ship was far more significant than any previous defection, handed the Storozhevoy to NATO, the entire Soviet strategic ASW doctrine would be rendered obsolete overnight. NATO would 1. Capture the Mertail VDS and learn how to counter it, making their SSBNs invisible again. 2. Reverse engineer the SSN-14 Silex and learn its guidance frequencies, its acoustic seeker properties, and its vulnerabilities. And, most devastatingly, capture all the ship's electronics, its communication devices, and critically, its cryptographic codebooks. Losing the Storozhevoy was not like losing a blueprint. It was like giving the enemy the entire doctrinal playbook, the engineering keys, and the codebooks to how the Soviet Union planned to fight and win a strategic nuclear war at sea.
The ensuing 10-hour chase was a case study in military panic, the fog of war, and profound systemic failure. The Soviet response was not a surgical operation, but a chaotic, desperate scramble that exposed the brittleness of their rigid top-down command structure. Much of what happened that night is known from later reconstructions of Soviet and Swedish records, a chilling puzzle pieced together from fragments of truth. Sablin's plan nearly succeeded without a hitch, but a single loyal junior officer who had voted against the mutiny managed to escape. He jumped overboard into the frigid November waters of the Daugava River, swam to shore, and ran to raise the alarm. It was here the mutiny was almost saved by the very corruption Sablin was protesting. The officer first tried to flag down cars, but was ignored. He then reached a guard post at the Bulgaria Naval Base and called the duty officer. The duty officer, assuming it was a drunken sailor or a holiday prank, refused to send a car, berating the officer for his frantic call. This single incident is a perfect microcosm of the Brezhnev era of stagnation. Problems of indiscipline and alcoholism were so widespread that the guard's dismissal of a frantic, soaking wet officer was, in that moment, the most logical assumption. The officer was forced to run to the base on foot, giving Sablin a crucial, irreplaceable head start of over 2 hours. The system's own rot, the very thing Sablin was protesting, had ironically enabled his escape. Sablin sailed dark, with his radar off to avoid detection, navigating by charts in the dense fog of the Baltic Sea. However, to avoid a catastrophic collision with the heavy civilian shipping traffic in the Gulf of Riga, he was forced to turn on his navigation radar intermittently. This was the fatal mistake. Around 8 a.m., Soviet T-16 Badger bombers scrambled into the air and, desperate for a target, picked up the Storozhevoy's radar emissions. The sentry was no longer a ghost. After a vice admiral's furious radio pleas for Sablin to return were met with defiant silence, word reached the very top. Premier Leonid Brezhnev was awakened at 4 a.m. Later accounts suggest orders from the Kremlin urged commanders to stop the ship by any means necessary, a directive that, in effect, meant destroy it if it couldn't be recaptured. The order scrambled half the Red Banner Baltic Fleet, 13 naval vessels, and a staggering 60 aircraft, including T-16 bombers and Yak-28 Brewer fighter bombers. The pursuit that followed was a disaster of friendly fire and systemic confusion. The Soviet response was simultaneously overwhelming in its force and catastrophically incompetent in its application. Friendly fire, Target 1. A squadron of Yak-28 bombers, vectored to the Urbay Strait, spotted a ship in the fog and immediately attacked. They lobbed FAB-250 bombs that raked a Soviet civilian freighter bound for Finland, narrowly avoiding an international incident. Friendly fire, Target 2. In the dawn light, the bombers attacked the wrong ship again.
This time, they positively identified and attacked one of their own pursuing warships, a sister Krivak-I frigate. Rockets hit the deck and the bridge, causing significant damage. The pursuit force was inflicting more damage on itself than on the mutineers. Refusal to fire. Meanwhile, pilots of the T-16 bombers armed with KSR-5 Kingfish anti-ship missiles repeatedly refused to fire. Listening to the chaotic, uncoded radio traffic from the fleet below, they correctly feared hitting one of their own ships, or, just as bad, a neutral Swedish vessel in the crowded international waters. This was the hunt's most terrifying and secret moment. Enraged by the incompetence of his pilots, Colonel General Sergei Gulyayev, commander of the Baltic Fleet's naval aviation, personally ordered a definitive strike. At 10:16 a.m., Gulyayev ordered the T-16s to use the weapon and, according to subsequent analysis of the recovered radio logs, reportedly invoked the special protocol for launch. The KSR-5 missiles they carried were dual-use, capable of carrying either a conventional warhead or a powerful nuclear warhead. This reported order is the ultimate confirmation of this story's thesis. The Kremlin, in that moment, appears to have decided that vaporizing its own $100 million frigate and 200-man Soviet crew was a better, more acceptable outcome than letting its apex engineering, the Meritail sonar, the Silex missile system, and its cryptographic codebooks fall into the hands of NATO. The order was not about punishing a mutineer. It was about protecting state secrets at an unthinkable cost. The launch sequence was reportedly confirmed at 10:27 a.m. However, the bomber commander, Colonel Arkhipov Savinkov, seeing the chaos of the friendly fire incidents below, committed a career-ending act of insubordination. He faked a radar malfunction, a magnetron failure, to abort the launch sequence, preventing a broken arrow incident and a potential nuclear escalation in the Baltic Sea. Finally, a Yak-28 pilot made a positive identification of the correct ship. The jet first strafed the Storozhevoy with 23mm cannon fire. True to his word to commit no violence, Sablin did not order his crew to return fire. The Yak then dropped an FAB-250 bomb. It struck the stern, blasting the deck and, critically, jamming the ship's rudder. The ship was stopped dead in the water, circling helplessly just 32 miles from Swedish territorial waters and potential safety. With the ship damaged and halted, the spell was broken. Loyal crew members, freed from their cabins, stormed the sonar compartment and released Captain Putorny. Putorny ran to the bridge with a pistol, shot Valery Sablin in the leg, and took command. At 10:32 a.m., he radioed the fleet. "The ship is stopped. I have taken control." Soviet Marines boarded the vessel, and the hunt was over.
The mutiny was over, but the Kremlin's crisis had just begun. The gunfire had stopped, but the ideological and technological breach had to be sealed. The leadership was now faced with two equally terrifying truths. First, a decorated political officer, their own class conscience, had staged a pure Leninist revolt against the state. And second, a crew had nearly delivered a top-secret strategic warship to NATO. The KGB's subsequent actions reveal a profound insight into the Soviet mindset. They had to choose which story was less damaging. A public admission of an attempted defection with a high-tech frigate was a failure of security. But an admission of an ideological mutiny by a Zampolit was a failure of communism itself. It suggested the system was so corrupt that its own enforcers were calling for its overthrow. The defection narrative, which they quietly leaked, was, to the Kremlin, the lesser of two evils. The Kremlin's cover-up was aided by an unlikely, silent partner, Sweden. Swedish intelligence monitoring stations on the island of Gotland
purportedly had a front-row seat to the entire 10-hour battle. They tracked the whole chaotic chase on their radar. More importantly, in their panic, the Soviet pilots and fleet commanders forgot to use their radio scramblers. Swedish intelligence operators purportedly captured much of the frantic, uncoded, and very stormy radio traffic. They heard the desperate orders, the pilots' refusals to fire, the frantic reports of friendly fire, and even the terrifying aborted orders for nuclear-capable missiles. But Sweden kept this explosive intelligence a closely guarded secret. These details remained classified for years, in large part to protect Sweden's sensitive listening technology and the full extent of their intelligence capabilities. Both sides, for different reasons, had a vested interest in burying the truth. The Kremlin immediately classified the entire event at the highest level. The official lie. The West and the Soviet public were told it was just a naval exercise that went wrong. To quell rumors, a sister Krivak-class frigate was quickly repainted with the Storozhevoy's hull number and paraded along the Baltic coast. The crew. The Storozhevoy's entire 150-man crew was dispersed. They were arrested, interrogated for months by the KGB, and forced to sign legally binding secrecy oaths. Their naval careers were, in a word, crushed. The ship, the battle-damaged Storozhevoy, was towed to the closed city of Liepaja for secret repairs. As soon as it was seaworthy, it was immediately transferred to the Pacific Fleet, as far from NATO's eyes and ears as possible, where it served quietly until its decommissioning in 2002. Sablin and his young aide were tried in secret in July 1976, charged with high treason. Alexander Shane, the 20-year-old seaman who had served as Sablin's second-in-command, was sentenced to 8 years in a hard labor camp. For Valery Sablin, there was no mercy. The system he sought to purify instead turned its full, cold fury upon him. He was convicted under Article 64A, treason to the motherland. On August 3, 1976, he was executed by a single pistol shot to the back of the head in the basement of Moscow's Lefortovo prison and buried in an unmarked grave. He was 37 years old.
The story was successfully buried. The truth of Sablin's Leninist revolt vanished into classified KGB archives. But the rumor of a mutiny, the defection narrative that the KGB had found convenient, persisted. In 1982, a U.S. naval student named Gregory D. Young, for his master's thesis, placed ads in émigré papers seeking knowledge of dissent in the Soviet Navy. The responses he received all pointed to the 1975 Storozhevoy incident, but they carried the KGB's false spin. It was an attempted defection to Sweden. Young's thesis, Mutiny on Storozhevoy, was a brilliant piece of analysis based on the only information available, the KGB's own disinformation. This thesis, one of only 37 copies, found its way to the Nimitz Library at the Naval Academy. There, an insurance salesman and amateur naval historian named Tom Clancy discovered it. Clancy used this real-life but fundamentally misunderstood story of a mutiny on a frigate as the direct inspiration for his fictional 1984 novel, The Hunt for Red October. The staggering global success of that book and the 1990 film became the Kremlin's ultimate unintentional cover-up. The fictional narrative of Marko Ramayev defecting to the West became so powerful, so globally accepted, that it completely eclipsed the real story. The world knew what happened in 1975, but what they knew was the KGB's preferred lie, immortalized by Hollywood. The Soviets buried the incident deep in secrecy, but fragments surfaced years later, echoing through history
and inspiring stories like the hunt for Red October. The real hunt for Red October was not a hunt for a submarine, but a hunt for a frigate. It was not a quest for defection, it was a quest for revolution. And the Kremlin's panic was not driven by the loss of a man, but by the potential loss of its most secret and revolutionary engineering, the apex ASW kill web that was the Storozhevoy. The true story reveals a profound irony. The Soviet system's corruption was so deep that its own immune system, the Zampolit, turned against it. And its command structure was so brittle that it nearly launched nuclear-capable weapons at itself to protect the secrets of its engineering.